Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's breakout session, The Evolving Crisis in Ukraine, How Different Parts of the U.S. Government Are Reacting in Real Time. I'm Sloan Mann, President of DT Global US. DT Global launched 3 years ago as a result of the merger between Development Transformations and AECOM International Development. This year, we're growing even more, with the recent acquisition of IMC Worldwide and the news that we're planning to acquire Cardno International Development in June, next month. Together, we'll be a truly global international development firm, bringing best practices from different donors to our programs, while we work to improve lives around the world. On behalf of USAID, DFAT, FCDO, European Commission, and our partners and communities we work with. Today's panel is incredibly timely, and I'm honored to have the chance to make this intro. For me, the war in Ukraine is so disturbing because of the human suffering taking place. Like many of you, I have personally worked in war-torn countries, and I know firsthand the toll that a conflict like this takes on the people for generations to come. That is why it is imperative to bring peace and stability back to Ukraine and to the region in general. This panel discussion will explore what tools the U.S. government has at its disposal to help move us towards a desired end state in Ukraine, both diplomatically and from a development lens. With that, I'm pleased to introduce today's moderator, Ann Simmons-Benton, the SID-Washington Deputy Chair and Principal of Deepwater Point. Ann?
Thank you. Thank you, Sloan, for the kind introduction. Ukraine's importance to the United States and Western Europe is the topic of much discussion these days, and we are pleased to have this esteemed panel to share their thoughts with us today. Let us consider Ukraine as an evolving post-Soviet model. The sunk costs of assistance to Ukraine since independence, and especially since the Maidan and the Revolution of Dignity. Ukraine's role as one of the world's breadbaskets. Russia's purposeful targeting of civilians. And the principle of a shameless war of destruction and conquest in the 21st century are just some of the thoughts raised on this subject. Today, I hope we can explore the U.S. response to Russia's invasion, especially in the non-military sphere. Are USAID and the State Department coordinated appropriately? What about other agencies and the specialized assistance they provide? Also, I hope we can talk about how the emergency assistance aimed at basic service delivery, humanitarian and refugee IDP-related functions, and accountability for potential war crimes, how it relates to long-standing anti-corruption, health, education, governance, and food and energy security programming, and the policy outcomes that programming supports. Since 2014, the United States has provided more than $11.3 billion in both security and non-security assistance to Ukraine, and three $1 billion sovereign loan guarantees. Add to that the new $40 billion supplemental recently signed by the President. And lastly, we will want to touch on what end states are likely and most desirable, now that we are 3 months into the conflict. How important is it to keep sanctions on Russia if they do not cease the war fighting, compensate Ukraine, and withdraw from occupied territories, the last two being hard to envision? What would be the knock-on effects of Russia as a pariah state for years to come? And lastly, when Ukraine gets to the reconstruction phase, with costs that will make the last two Ukraine supplemental appropriations look small, in what ways can we all realistically help? To bring us the knowledge and the background on these issues, I am pleased to introduce a unique panel that has the breadth and depth to answer these questions and to guide our understanding. I'd like to introduce Ambassador Eric Schultz, who served in Russia as the economic counselor and in Ukraine as the deputy chief of mission, as well as U.S. Ambassador to Zambia. Ambassador Julieta Noyes is the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration at the U.S. Department of State, and also serves as the U.S. Ambassador to Croatia. Karen Chandler is the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary, Programs and Operations, as well as the Director of Offensive Weapons Removal and Abatement in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. And rounding us up is Ambassador Erin McKee, who is the Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Europe and Eurasia at the Agency for International Development. Assistant Administrator McKee served in Russia, both in the private sector and in the early days of USAID in Russia. She recently returned as the U.S. Ambassador to Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. I have asked the panelists to share opening remarks from their vantage point on Russia. I will start with you, Eric.
Great. So I think I'm, a bit of a ringer because I'm the only person on the panel who's not a current serving U.S. government official. I retired in 2018, so I don't know whether that gives me sort of an advantage or not. I think I can speak a little bit more freely, maybe more critically than some of the others might. But so by way of background, as Anne mentioned, I served in Moscow 2007 to 2009 for Bill Burns and John Byerly. And then after that, I went to Kyiv, and I was John Teff's DCM from 2010 to 2013. Then I had my own mission after that in Africa. Since I retired, I've been working, I guess the technical term would be lobbyist. My latest job ended on February 24th. It was working for Naftogaz, the state corporation of oil and gas in Ukraine, so that was a bit of a drag, to lose your income. Not that I have any bad feelings towards the Russians at all because of that. So I actually wanted to kind of back up, and so because Anne had asked me to sort of lay the table and sort of explain how we got where we are in a sense, and why, and how that might complicate resolving the the crisis and finding a way out of this. So I'll go back to 2000 to 2002. I served in Ashgabat. I was actually the DCM, and then I was the chargé for a long period of time. I got to know Sapo Murat Niyazov, Turkmenbashi pretty well. There was a period of time when my friends in the Foreign Service thought I was the most likely person to be named U.S. Ambassador to North Korea, because it seemed like I was always working with one dictator or another, and it would be tough to top Turkmenbashi, although I think Putin manages. But when I was in Ashgabat, I used to have lunch with the Russian ambassador and DCM on a monthly basis, and we would basically just, shoot the breeze, kind of compare notes. It was an extremely friendly relationship, right? Then I went away. I was in Zimbabwe for 3 years in Africa, and, the Russians didn't play a particularly useful role in Africa. They were, especially in Zimbabwe, they were always opposing everything that we were doing. And I can tell you that the the Russian mission in Zimbabwe was 90% FSB. Almost everybody there was an intel agent. Anyway, so after Zimbabwe, I came to Moscow in 2007, and and I noticed this almost immediately, like this extreme change in the relationship that we had with the Russians in 2000 to 2002. In that period of time, it had just completely changed. By 2007, it was close to hostile, and I was there when when Putin made his big speech in Munich, which I think in retrospect everyone sort of identifies as the beginning of this downward spiral that's led to where we are now. Important to understand who Putin is. He's KGB. That was what he was trained. It's what he does. And under his leadership, KGB, FSB, whatever you want to call it, they really took over control of Russia, both financially, politically, in every way. I used to sort of draw a comparison between Ukraine and Russia in that when Yanukovych was the president of Ukraine, my argument was that that the Ukrainian mafia, because he was actually part of the Ukrainian mafia, well, Soviet mafia, they were on top, and the KGB were the junior partner, and in Russia was the other way around. KGB was calling the shots, but the mafia were the junior partners, which gives you some idea how the country worked. So everything pretty much from 2007 on, I would say, was pretty negative, and it just kind of went down year after year after year. And that was in spite of the reset that we attempted in 2008, which I don't even know how many resets we tried, and I don't know which one that was. There were a lot over the years. They were all unsuccessful. In fact, I think that every one of them gave Putin the wrong impression, which was that we were prepared to accommodate his interests and his desires. So my thing was the economy, and I can tell you that what I found particularly curious about Russia in 2007, 2009, that was when the Great Recession hit and the Russian economy kind of tanked. And it never really truly recovered. Putin's approach to the economy was he had to remain in control of the economy because he didn't want the economy to be a rival source of political power in the system. So he wasn't willing to truly reform the economy, wasn't really willing to open it up. Sergey Brin's Russian, helped set up Google, was quoted once as saying, I could never have done what I did in Russia, because eventually somebody would have knocked on the door and said, I'm your new partner. And that's just how the system worked. So I had a friend who was a very prominent American businessman back then who gave me this sort of quick and dirty of the Russian economy. He said, look, this was 2007. He said, Vladimir Putin, sorry, let me back up. The Russian economy has been growing at 7 or 8% a year. Putin and his cronies steal half of that, but they use the other half to improve the living standards of average Russians, which makes them the most progressive and arguably the most popular government in the history of the country. But then he said, so what happens if growth drops from 8% to 4%? Does he steal all of it? Does he steal half of it? Does he give all of it to the average Russian to continue growing their living standards? So, this was very prescient because after the Great Recession, it did actually drop. Growth was about 1% for a while. Really never got much over that. And I think the verdict of history is that Putin and his pals stole everything. So average Russians saw their living standards stagnate quite seriously, during that period of time. So Putin had to have a new social contract with the people. And what was the new social contract? The new social contract was nationalism. So 2008 was Georgia. After that, we had Ukraine, we had Crimea, we had Donbass, we had Syria, you name it. It's been one thing after another. So I would argue, and since I was part of this, I can take some of the blame for it, that really it was a bipartisan failure to take them seriously as an opponent. We tended to sort of view Russia as a has-been, a country that really wasn't up to snuff anymore. It couldn't really rival us. And I think that was really wrong. There were two reasons for that. One is that there's a lot of power in the ability to just screw things up. And that was one thing that Putin definitely had and was willing to use. And the second thing is that I think they had hit on our Achilles heel. Excuse me for saying it, and not just the U.S., but I mean the West. But it was greed. The think tanks and the elite and whatnot all could be seduced with spots on boards of governors, with lobbying contracts, you name it. So in Europe they call it Schroederization. Which I think is pretty fair, actually.
So maybe I'll stop you there, Eric, And
Geez, I'm only halfway through.
I know,
Haven't
because
gotten to Ukraine
I've
yet.
got 2 more questions for you. I don't want to, I want to make sure the panelists, would you maybe wrap this part up and
Well, sure.
save
Okay.
some for your other 2 questions?
Let me skip then quickly to Ukraine, because I actually think that the problem in Ukraine is not dissimilar. We didn't take Ukraine seriously either. We thought it was kind of a silly country in some ways, very corrupt, very inefficient. And, you know, we looked kind of at the potential, but we thought, well, you know, it's never going to really achieve that potential. And I think that was a mistake. And in fact, I'll skip to the very end. When I was in Georgia, I had a very good friend of mine who was the deputy foreign minister. And as I was leaving, I was going to go work on the Ukraine desk. He said, you were going to go work on the most important country in the former Soviet Union, because what happens to Ukraine will determine what happens to all the rest of us. If it makes it, if it's successful, if it's an independent country, then all the rest of us have a chance to be independent and successful as well. And I think that that's kind of still the case. So when we're looking at how does this crisis resolve itself, what do we do in the future, we should keep that in mind, that this is a country that matters for its own sake, not just because of its relationship with Russia.
Thank you so much, and I'm sorry to have interrupted.
That's all right.
Julieta, would you please give us your remarks and your thoughts from your venue, particularly from PRM?
Sure. So thank you, Anne, and thank you, Eric. I think I can attest to some of what you said, because in 2007, you were hanging out with Russian diplomats. By the time I got to Croatia in 2015, I refused to invite the Russian ambassador to the 4th of July reception. But it's a real pleasure to join you here today and to join these distinguished colleagues on this panel to talk about these important issues. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you about the U.S. response and about our assistance to over 6 million people, Ukrainians and third country nationals, who've had to flee Ukraine as a result of Russia's unprovoked and unjustified invasion. Our partnership and our commitment to the people of Ukraine is steadfast and enduring, and we in the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, PRM as we call ourselves, will continue to stand with the people and the government of Ukraine. We're working very closely with our European allies and partners on the forefront of this response, as well as with international organizations and NGOs like many of you represented here, to mitigate the humanitarian impacts of this war. The United States remains the single largest single country donor to the humanitarian assistance response in Ukraine. We've provided over $1 billion in humanitarian assistance since Russia first invaded Ukraine 8 years ago, including more than $688 million this year alone. PRM's proportion of this humanitarian aid comes to about $212 million in response to the refugee crisis. More than $93 million of that funding has been directed to efforts inside of Ukraine, while another $119 million has been supporting the efforts to address the needs of refugees who have fled across the border to neighboring countries. So to give you some specifics, $48 million in Poland, $26 million in Moldova, $10 million in Romania, $9 million in Hungary, $4 million in the Slovak Republic, $400,000 in Belarus, and more than $21 million for partner activities in the region. That's a lot of different chunks of money, but that just shows you how big the crisis is, because people have had to flee to all of these different countries. Now, our funding in PRM is primarily channeled through international organizations who are the experts in responding to the needs of vulnerable people displaced by conflict. These include the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, the International Organization for Migration, IOM, UNICEF, the UN Population Fund, and the World Health Organization. We partner with these organizations to deliver life-saving aid and protection throughout the world. With our funding, they support and bolster the capacities of governments and international and local NGOs to provide protection services and urgently needed aid to the refugees. Our assistance provides those fleeing the war urgent relief at reception centers, including food, safe drinking water, shelter, and clothing. We also support emergency health care and psychosocial services. And in addition, U.S. taxpayer funding provided through PRM to these partners covers legal advice, case management support, and referrals to services for those in need. We provide multi-purpose cash assistance as an important part of the transitional safety net for refugees. Now, Ukraine's neighbors have also demonstrated tremendous solidarity and compassion in their response to and their caring for these refugees. And we're especially grateful for the outpouring of support from the countries that have offered temporary protection mechanisms that allow the refugees to integrate into their state welfare systems, to access health care, child care, education, and housing programs, and the right to work. I traveled to Poland and Moldova about a month ago, shortly after I was confirmed for this position, and I saw firsthand how national and local officials working with local NGOs and private citizens are responding to the crisis. At a government reception center in Warsaw, for example, I saw how recent arrivals could walk into the center and apply for a national identity number, enroll their kids in school, apply for social services, get specialized counseling and other support, and walk out with a bank account on top of all of that. It was efficient and it was impressive. This is one of the, I hate to use the word advantages, but when you have a crisis that's happening in Europe where there are functional governments, this kind of response can be a lot more efficient and effective than in some of the other places where PRM works. That said, we know that this immediate response is just the first step. As the war continues, Ukraine, its neighbors, and its partners will need medium and long-term plans for supporting the refugees and those internally displaced inside of Ukraine. They're going to need support until the war ends and then for that vital rebuilding phase. So as part of that longer-term effort, PRM is now working on plans for deploying additional U.S. supplemental funding. We're preparing a response to the UN's recently revised and released Humanitarian Flash Appeal and Regional Refugee Response Plan. The plan lays out programmatic and budgetary requirements to sustain the current level of Ukrainian refugee populations, and it makes provision for additional arrivals. It's also, I'm sure, making provision for some of those refugees who are now returning to Ukraine. In the months ahead, PRM will continue to work with our humanitarian partners and to advance humanitarian and migration diplomacy with host nations to maintain their responses in line with international standards. We will work with the EU to provide additional funding and operational support. We'll continue to work with our international humanitarian partners to meet the crucial response gaps. And we're also working with national NGOs to build capacity, to build their capacity for the long term. All parts of the State Department, and you were asking about what the coordination looks like, all parts of the State Department, together with our friends in USAID, are extremely engaged in this effort. Now, the most recent UN appeal is an extension of the initial appeal that they had put out on March 1st. The new one now covers the period through December of this year. And in this appeal, the UN has requested or identified the need for $1.8 billion in funding for 8.3 million displaced people. It addresses the need for a multi-partner, multi-sector response strategy in coordination with 142 partners to support the host governments of Poland, Moldova, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Czechia, and Belarus. Protection services and urgent humanitarian assistance for Ukrainians and non-Ukrainians who've had to flee that fighting are included, as well as international protection efforts and support for those who want to return to their countries of origin. It includes support for impacted host communities. It includes support for refugees to be enrolled in local education, social protection, and health services. Now, the effective coordination of all of our partners, those within the U.S. government, those within the European Union, within the international organizations, within the international NGOs and the local NGOs, is absolutely critical for us to get this right. and to meet that need that Eric was talking about taking Ukraine seriously and getting it right so that we get the future right. We will continue to support this plan in the United States consistent with our leadership as the largest single country donor to the Ukraine crisis, and we are grateful that other partners like the European Union are also giving generously. Now, a significant factor in all of these needs, because these are some big numbers, these are some very big numbers, it's just the sheer numbers of those displaced by this fighting. Already over 6 million people have left Ukraine. Over 8 million people, we estimate, are now, or the UN High Commissioner estimates, are now internally displaced. And there could be further displacements as the fighting continues in the Donbass or in the south. We'll continue to do contingency planning to respond to the needs as they change. And meanwhile, UNHCR is also meeting with the host countries in the region to see how their needs are changing as the crisis shifts. The bottom line is that Putin's unprovoked war, latest war in Ukraine, has created enormous pain and hardship for the people of Ukraine and enormous challenges for its partners. But it has also led to unprecedented support from Ukraine's friends and partners. And as challenging as this crisis has been and continues to be, I am heartened by how much the international community has come together to support Ukraine at this terrible, terrible time. Thanks.
Thank you, Julieta. Now, Karen, I'm going to turn to you in this terrible tragedy. Before we can do much else, your office is going to have to help. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. Good afternoon, and thank you, Anne, for inviting me to be part of this very important conversation. It's an honor to be part of such a distinguished panel. I want to start by highlighting the fact that the United States is the global leader in landmine clearance and conventional weapons destruction. Since 1993, the United States has invested more than $4.2 billion for the safe clearance of landmines and explosive remnants of war, as well as the security and safe disposal of excess small arms, light weapons, and munitions in more than 100 countries. In 2021 alone, the United States invested more than $265 million for conventional weapons destruction in 62 countries around the world. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk about our critical efforts to support the people of Ukraine. For more than 12 weeks now, Russia has waged an unprovoked and brutal war against Ukraine, its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and its people. Beaten back from its failed attempt to seize Kyiv, Russia continues a grinding offensive across Ukraine's south and east. The United States, as well as nearly 40 allies and partner countries, are working around the clock to expedite shipments of arms and equipment essential to Ukraine's defense. Over $3.9 billion in U.S. arms and equipment delivered since February 24th has been critical in helping Ukraine defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. We have seen how important items like U.S. anti-tank missiles, air defense systems, artillery, and unmanned aerial vehicles are to this fight. Today, I'd like to highlight another issue, namely how the United States, together with our allies and partners, must also take action to protect residents from unexploded ordnance and start laying the groundwork to support Ukraine's post-conflict recovery. From 2004 to 2021, the United States provided more than $77 million to support life-saving demining operations and other conventional weapons destruction activities in Ukraine, and we may remain dedicated to supporting this critical work in the months and years ahead. Today, I would like to paint a picture of the obviously very challenging situation we're facing on the ground in Ukraine, and then provide some of the near and longer-term ways we can help the people of Ukraine safely return to their homes and livelihoods. First, let me start with the scope of the problem. At the end of 2021, the 8-year-long conflict with Russia in eastern Ukraine had resulted in a line of contact between the Ukrainian government and Russia's proxies, the anti-government forces that Russia arms, trains, leads, and fights alongside. The areas along the line of contact running through the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, or provinces, suffered from extensive landmine and explosive remnants of war contamination already. These explosive hazards pose a major threat to thousands of Ukrainian civilians living in the conflict area. In 2021, 34 civilians were killed and another 17 civilians were injured by explosive hazards in eastern Ukraine. In the early weeks and months of Russia's all-out invasion beginning in February 2022, US-funded and international demining NGOs were focused on evacuating staff and equipment to western Ukraine while simultaneously providing explosive risk ordnance education. That's a mouthful. We call it EOR for short. That reached more than 18 million at-risk Ukrainian civilians. More recently, these NGOs have shifted their operational focus from the Donbas region to liberated areas of Kyiv and Chernihiv oblasts, and are starting survey and clearance operations to supplement Ukrainians' national demining capacity. Ukrainian demining authorities, such as the State Emergency Service, are understandably overwhelmed by the massive scale of contamination. They report destroying more than 26,000 explosive hazards in Kyiv Oblast alone as of April 30th. 26,000. That is 4 times the number of explosive hazards that PM's NGO implementers destroyed in the Donbass over a 4-year period. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has generated acute needs for conventional weapons destruction assistance. Russia has bombed and shelled massive amounts of Ukraine's territory, including major population centers. International demining experts estimate that Russian munitions may have dud rates between 10 and 30%, meaning massive amounts of unexploded ordnance will remain in the ground for years to come. Additionally, the Ukrainian Ministry of Agriculture estimates that approximately 10% of the country's farmland is now contaminated by explosive hazards. Unexploded ordnance, landmines, and other explosive remnants of war will exacerbate global food insecurity by impacting Ukraine's food production and supply chain, block humanitarian aid workers from accessing Ukraine's hardest hit areas, and hinder the restoration of critical civilian infrastructure. Additionally, returning refugees will stream back into communities contaminated by explosive remnants of war. Ukraine's national capacity to clear explosive remnants of war is already overwhelmed, and many returning civilians may feel compelled to clear explosive remnants of war themselves, causing casualties from these dangerous items to spike. For context, in the immediate wake of Raqqa, Syria's liberation from ISIS, the city averaged more than 5 civilian casualties per day from explosive remnants of war. As of April 4th, Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs estimated that approximately 80,000 kilometers of land was suspected to be contaminated by landmines and unexploded ordnance. That's a combined area of West Virginia and Connecticut put together, and represents approximately 13% of Ukraine's total territory. Prior to Russia's all-out invasion in February, PM's demining program in Ukraine had cleared 3.4 kilometers of contaminated land in the Donbass since 2017 at a cost of $23.6 million. This represents 0.04% of the current estimate of suspected hazardous areas. The problem is huge. Let me turn now to the United States response. Prior to the 2022 invasion, the Department of State trained and equipped Ukraine's state emergency service demining teams that are now working tirelessly to address landmines and unexploded ordnance. Since the start of the war, we have provided explosive ordnance disposal equipment to Ukraine's demining authorities and are committed to providing continued assistance and capacity building. Facilitating assistance delivery, preventing civilian explosive remnants of war casualties, and restoring farmland to productive use will require significant and urgent international response. Deploying US-funded demining teams will be essential to supplement Ukraine's existing national capacity to conduct area-wide surveys to locate explosive remnants of war, safely remove and destroy those hazards, and provide explosive ordnance risk education to returning civilian populations. I should note that US-funded demining partners are already providing extensive risk education to Ukrainians both in person and in social media. We believe they have reached 18 million people already, but this will be an ongoing need. Concurrent training and equipping efforts are needed to expand Ukraine's enduring capacity to address explosive remnants of war and sustained international assistance as well. Helping Ukraine to safely survey and clear unexploded ordnance hazards will be a complex and difficult challenge. The United States and its implementing partners remain in the early stages of assessing our options as to how best to support this important humanitarian effort. At a minimum, based on what we know now and comparable past operations, we predict the international community will need to strengthen the explosive ordnance disposal capacity of Ukrainians' demining authorities, such as by training and equipping new teams so they can quickly and safely respond to explosive remnants of war as civilians return to their homes. We will also need to surge demining teams to conduct survey and clearance throughout the country, initially focusing on high-priority infrastructure to facilitate the rapid provision of humanitarian and stabilization assistance. And finally, expanding explosive ordnance risk education efforts, targeting internally displaced people and refugees to prepare them for safe return. Without a complete understanding of the extent and nature of explosive remnants of war contamination, it is tough to estimate what it will take to address this problem. However, it is safe to say that the resource requirements will be massive, and the cleanup effort will last for many years, if not decades. In the Ukraine supplemental funding bill signed by President Biden this week, $100 million was authorized for the State Department to begin the effort to reduce contamination from landmines and unexploded ordnance, in addition to addressing chemical, biological, and radiological threats. This $100 million is a very significant first step towards addressing this urgent challenge. Ensuring the safe return of displaced people and getting Ukraine's farmland back to productive use are priorities supported across the United States government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. Erin, I turn to you and from USAID, and help us maybe have a little more positive picture of where we can go forward.
The gauntlet has been thrown. I will do my best. Thank you, Anne, and good afternoon, everybody. It is an honor to spend time with the distinguished panel here today and have a chance to talk to you a little bit about what we've been doing and where we hope to go. I want to start by saying that USAID has stood with the Ukrainians for 30 years, since we first opened our doors following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Putin's war has only deepened our commitment to an independent, democratic, free, and prosperous Ukraine. As we think about USAID's role in the U.S. government's response, current response in Ukraine, I would first note that USAID operates along multiple timelines with immediate, short, and long-term goals, as all of you in this room are probably more intimately familiar with than I am at this moment. That means we have been planning for the future, safeguarding the past, and meeting urgent needs of the moment, all at the same time for many, many months. We began preparing for the worst-case scenario for a potential crisis long before Russia's troops initiated, long before Putin initiated the full-scale invasion. In the months leading up to the war, USAID, in concert with the interagency, we activated a team of experts to develop contingency plans, convene our European partners who, as you've heard already, have been fundamental to the response and support to the Ukrainian people. We haven't done it alone. While the U.S. is the largest donor, it has been the combination of both goodwill, resource strength, presence, and response that Ukraine is still standing and fighting courageously today. And so those early days, we identified the humanitarian resources for a war that we actually hoped would never happen. But on the day of the war, we USAID, together with our partners, launched a nationwide humanitarian response. The life-saving assistance that we were able to mobilize on February 25th included food, shelter, clean water, medical supplies for communities affected by the violence. With that, we immediately deployed our largest disaster assistance response team, or DART team, on the ground, and we were able to continually adjust our response to meet the evolving needs on the ground. The DART team also facilitates coordination between the various humanitarian organizations. And my colleague, Ambassador Noyes, Julieta, described a lot of what we were doing in the humanitarian space outside Ukraine to deal with the refugee challenges. What I'd like to talk about is what we also were doing inside Ukraine and what we're continuing to do. As we heard from our colleagues, getting that data and that insight and those challenges to be able to not only pulse check where we are today, but map a way ahead for the future. USAID, fortunately, not one single program stopped working. We have over 40 under, sort of the USAID Ukraine mission, over 40 activities that never missed a beat. 700 implementing partners on the ground in the country that pivoted and immediately tapped into those local networks and using the resources that they had and the relationships that they had forged through our development partnership over the years to immediately respond to the internally displaced persons, but to also ensure that service delivery continued, the protection services were provided, that the lights stayed on, that the hospitals could operate, that the interrupted supply chains were circumvented, medicines got where they needed to go, food and relief supplies got into the communities where they were most needed. So we are leveraging decades of what we have spent investing in our people, our partners, and our institutions, spanning all aspects of Ukrainian society to make sure that all is not lost to Putin's senseless violence. So even as we are currently stepping up our humanitarian efforts, we remain steadfast in our commitment to consolidate, safeguarding, consolidating, and building towards Ukraine's independent, democratic, and more prosperous future. So Ukraine's economy, infrastructure, and democratic institutions have all been assaulted, have all been targets of Putin's assault. And the fact that those investments and that focus that we made over the years have helped them build that resilience. Some have been hit, some have crumbled. We're going to have a lot of work ahead in the recovery and reconstruction. But this shows why development matters, even in the European context, because those partnerships and that foundation upon which we provided to our partners in the Ukrainian people has served them extremely well in this moment of their darkest hour. So the Ukrainian government right now, where are the needs, back to inside Ukraine, requires budgetary assistance to ensure it can continue operating and respond to critical needs and deliver essential services to its citizens. This is an opportunity and a partnership that USAID often doesn't encounter in a conflict or humanitarian crisis. We have a standing government. We have a government that is being responsive to its people. We have a government that wants to be strengthened and make sure that that social contract between it and its people endures and that that confidence is sustained. And so rather than sort of coming in from the outside, we have to be very mindful of not creating parallel structures, parallel systems to deliver budgetary, financial, technical, all of the assistance that all of the partners are bringing to bear. We have to work alongside and by, with, and through our Ukrainian partners, and they need to lead the way and identify both the vision for the future as well as articulate immediate needs. But the good news is the development work that we had done over the decades gave them the systems and the insight to be able to identify those needs in real time and respond, at least when we can make those connections when they've been disrupted by conflict, also in real time. Let me give you a quick example. You probably all heard about, in December, Ukraine and Moldova disconnected from the Russian grid. This was part of a multi-year effort and investment in the energy sector by USAID to help bolster and foster Ukrainian and Moldovan energy independence. The December unplug was a test. It was proof of concept, and we were going to only run it for a couple of months and then plug back into the Russian grid, do some testing, make sure that everything was all right, and continue to do that work. The good news is that we didn't have to get reconnected. Now, we are scrambling to make sure that we can sustain their Western connection and keep the lights on. But the fact that the need for energy independence and market diversification drove that opportunity for us to be able to take a powerful tool out of Putin's hands and make sure that the lights stayed on and electricity was still running throughout Ukraine. It's just one example of where that nexus of previous investments really pays dividends when it counts. I'm going off script, sorry. And so as we work to address both the immediate and then the short and medium and long-term impacts of the war and provide much needed relief, we have already begun looking towards the future. And we're planning support for Ukrainian-led efforts towards recovery and reconstruction. And one of the challenges around that is, remember, as Eric was describing, what we were all working on top of was not a lesser developed country or an underdeveloped country. It was a misdeveloped country, right? Former Soviet nations of the bloc were built on, command economy, crumbling architecture, systems that were either antiquated, stolen, and adapted poorly, and architecture and infrastructure that certainly was not up to European standards. And as we look towards EU accession and in the reconstruction process, we've got to make sure that we meet those standards and help our partners in Ukraine and elsewhere who are facing the collateral damage from this conflict recognize the misdeveloped starting point, and we sort of take course corrective action and not try and sort of band-aid on top, but really use this fundamental moment to discard the inherited Soviet crumbling architecture and do something better. So while we anticipate that the European Union and the multilateral institutions and the international financial institutions will play a major role in reconstruction efforts, USAID stands ready and will provide critical support to rehabilitate, revitalize the social institutions, restore the livelihoods of the people, to provide opportunity to the Ukrainian people when they return home, when it's safe to do so. And together with the government of Ukraine, we will ensure that the Ukrainians have the tools that they need to make progress towards EU membership, to increase the quality of service delivery, to give all of Ukrainians hope and opportunity for a better tomorrow. On the critical reform agenda, since 2014, we've helped Ukraine improve their democratic and governance structure, and this is a key pillar, as I meant, about the Ukraine being in the driver's seat, to make sure that that pathway towards reform, that the accusations of endemic corruption, that we can shine a spotlight on that and ensure that transparency and accountability, particularly with all of these resources coming in, not just from the United States, but across, as we heard, so many partners, are accounted for. The last thing that President Zelensky needs is accusations of a lack of, of opacity or a lack of transparency in the recovery and reconstruction process. And it's our responsibility to make sure that that transparency and accountability for all of the resource flows now and going forward, that they can answer that question. I got grilled by Congress on this very point. Where's accountability? Where's the transparency? How do you know what's going where? And the good news is that the anti-corruption work that we've been doing for years is lending itself to developing even more robust systems and being able to, not only at the national level, but at the local government and community level, make sure that there's transparency on the resource flows that are going from the center to the decentralized, to the oblasts and the rayons. So let me just end by saying this, because I'm sure there'll be some questions. We believe the Ukrainian people must determine their priorities and direction of recovery and reconstruction. The war has been an assault on self-determination and democracy, and the last thing that we, the United States or the European partners, should do is then dictate how Ukraine should build its future in the way ahead. An attempt to rob Ukraine of its right to its own path, we have to make sure that that is restored and that their independence and their sovereignty is at the heart of where we go next. So as we stand with Ukraine, we will relentlessly continue to support Ukraine as they envision and deliver a stronger post-war Ukraine, demonstrating to the world that hope, not despair, opportunity, not threats, that prosperity, not dependence, and security, not domination, will prevail.
I promised you a panel with breadth and depth. I have never seen a room so quiet as you listen to the speakers, but they were truly captivating. And while I have a whole page of questions for our panelists, we are actually at time. So what I'd like to do is, since I'm the deputy chair of SID, break a rule a little bit and just ask everyone maybe for one final thought before we close. And the only reason is because we have virtual programming at the same time. Otherwise, I'd really go another half an hour. So, Eric, maybe I should end with you, because you have the big picture, and you can say what you want. Everyone else is the government.
Yeah, and I talked too long, too.
No, you didn't talk too long. I just was trying to keep track of time. Yes, sir. Erin, how about, what about how can the donor community focus on making an improvement in a complicated issue of exporting Ukraine's blockaded agricultural products? Is that something you can do in a minute?
That is a panel for about 5 hours, but let me just say that, as Ann mentioned, Ukraine is a part of the breadbasket of the world, and so we are laser focused. The interagency is laser focused on a project called Get Out the Grain, and part of that, but it's an iterative process, right? So we're looking at a multimodal overland transport opportunity while Odessa, the port of Odessa, which is the primary point of export, remains mined. And it's the Ukrainians who've mined it to make sure that the Russians don't get any closer, and with safe passage to get it out. Those negotiations underway, that's down the road. So in the immediate term, we have a winter harvest that must get to market. Ukrainian farmers need income so that they can then plant for the next season. And planting for the next season means hand in hand with our colleagues demining those fields so that they can plant safely. So it's very complex, but we are laser focused on it, and it is a top priority because anything we can bring to market, not only for Ukrainian farmers and restoration of livelihoods, is a good thing, but it also helps reduce the pressure on the global food supply chain that we know is under extreme threat and has implications far beyond Europe and Eurasia.
Yes, Administrator Powers spoke about apples in Moldova, so I hope next year at the conference we talk about the grain, getting it out of Ukraine. Karen, how do we work with the local population in demining? Does this create better ownership, speed up the removal? What are your thoughts in engaging with ministries and also at the oblast level?
So fortunately, we have, with our implementing partners, almost all of the staff is actually Ukrainian staff. So that helps a great deal because they have the touch point with their neighbors and with their local officials in their cities. And so one of the things that is very helpful is that we can turn to those implementing partners and ask them to do both technical and non-technical survey in the surrounding areas. And so some of that is just asking local people, hey, where is that part contaminated? What do you guys see? Have there been any casualties there? So you're really leaning on them to develop those personal relationships, and that's again why it's so important to have this be a Ukrainian-led effort. We also work very closely with the Ukrainian Demining Ministry, with the state emergency services, so that they can lead and guide those efforts. So one of the things that we've seen in other areas that are heavily contaminated, for example, just thinking about Vietnam, for example, we rely on the government to tell us, where do you want us to go? Because they know best what the needs are for their critical infrastructure. We will follow that and demine in those areas first, always following their priorities. So I think it's really relying on the local staff to be the implementers, and then relying on working with the governments at all levels to be able to let them determine the priorities.
Yeah, I think it's one of the best examples of locally led development there is with our help. Julieta, what is the U.S. government doing to expand pathways for refugees from the Ukraine conflict to coming to the U.S.?
So we work very closely with our partners for the Ukrainian refugees, as I discussed earlier, going to neighboring countries. And when I was out there and spoke with the refugees, they were all quite insistent that they wanted to stay close to home. Keep in mind that 90% of those who have left Ukraine are women and children, and who have they left behind? Their husbands, their fathers, their sons, their brothers. And so they want to stay close so that they can reunite with their family members. That said, we realize that there's a need for international responsibility sharing, and we also wanted to demonstrate American compassion with regard to these refugees. So President Biden announced an initiative for up to 100,000 Ukrainians to come to the United States under a sponsor-led humanitarian parole program. I just got some figures this morning that in the few weeks since this program was announced, over 40,000 sponsors have registered for the program, and something like 25,000 Ukrainians have registered to come to the United States, and somewhere just over 3,000 have actually arrived, but more applications every day. So we think that this is part of our effort, but we also are very cognizant of the fact that, and the people who I met with told me, we are not refugees. We are temporarily displaced. We are going home. And they really want to go home. They want to do all of that rebuilding that Erin and Karen were talking about, and it is our firm determination to help them get there. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric, given your experience and hearing about the heart and the soul of the Ukrainian people wanting to return, what do you think is the best end state for Ukraine, and how does the U.S. help?
So I've been sort of sitting here thinking about the best way to wrap this up, and I think I can address your question as well, and I can kind of stay under my time limit here. So I've always said that, having served in both countries, that I was more optimistic about Ukraine in the long run than Russia, because the Ukrainians were actually capable of reforming, and the Russian system really isn't. I think what you're going to see when we come out of this conflict is that that will be even more exacerbated. So, you know, you're going to end up with a Ukrainian government, you know, like, it's not going to be passed as prologue in Ukraine, because it's a government that has not actually always represented the interests of its people particularly well. I don't think they're going to be able to do that in the new Ukraine that will emerge after this war. I think that the government will be held to a much higher standard than has been true in the past. In Russia, it will be worse, actually. I think I'm extremely pessimistic about the future of Russia. And I'll explain one reason why. Because all the smart, young, educated Russians are leaving. And they're leaving in part because of sanctions, and they're leaving in part because of Putin, and because there's no hope. So who's going to build a better Russia? Who's going to build a more successful Russia? Those people are gone. So that's actually my sort of summation is, the best outcome of this, from our point of view, is I think the outcome that's very likely to occur, which is we're going to end up with a better Ukraine, and we're going to end up with a weaker Russia.
Well, that's a lovely way to end this panel. I would like to thank our esteemed panelists. Please join me in thanking them for such great remarks.